John, it's an sorry. John, it's an honor for me to interview you, to explore your distinguished career in nephrology. But quite frankly, I see it as an exciting and at times perplexing story. Really a mystery story, if I may say, which demands answers. How does one stumble into a life of nephrology, do so much pioneering work in renal transplantation, and then pursue relentlessly an ever-widening commitment to higher values in kidney disease and medicine in general? So let's start with the beginning of your story and reveal the events which steered you from one chapter to the next. First question, what was medical ethics to you as a medical student and junior physician?
Well, when I was a student, which was in the 50s, 40s actually, late 40s and early 50s, medical ethics as a subject really did not exist. It was assumed that ethical behavior by physicians was one of the parts of the art of medicine that one learnt as an apprentice by walking the wards with seniors who pontificated a little bit and who were very important. But from them, one was meant to learn what was needed for ethical behavior in what was then the centerpiece, the doctor-patient relationship. So many things have changed since then, but it was essentially a subject that was not talked about.
Now, as a young man, you found yourself in the military in India.
Yes. After I graduated in London at Barts Hospital, I was called up. The war was over, actually, but military service continued. And I had the good fortune, because overall it was a very good experience, though there were some funny periods in it. I had a very good experience of 2 years in the army, most of which was spent as a medical officer in India. And there I was with the Gurkha Brigade, and at that time Nepal was not an open country to Europeans, so the recruitment of Gurkhas was carried on the border. There was a border at each end of Nepal. There was a border post, and I was in, well, both of them at different times.
You must have seen some real raw medicine.
Broadly speaking, the troops, the Gurkha troops, were fairly well. When we recruited them, they had to walk out of the valleys, which is roughly 11,000 feet up, 11,000 feet down, every day for a few days. The ones that got to the camp were fit, and broadly speaking, there was not a problem. The area of India that we were in had no medical coverage at all for the local people, zero. So the other medical officer and myself would see every local villager who was sitting under the shade of a certain tree at 9 o'clock in the morning, and we'd see them for free, using the equipment provided by the Queen, or rather the military. And we did actually have some extraordinary medical experiences there.
And then you became aware, I guess perhaps painfully, of humans with absolutely no opportunity, no access to health care.
It was extraordinary experience. We were the only people there. We were the surgeons, the anesthetist, the physician, the lab person, the whole lot rolled into two. And we felt justified, and this is where some of the sort of innate hubris of medicine starts to come through. We felt justified in doing things for which we were not trained.
And then from India, soon thereafter, you find yourself on the wards with Sheila Sherlock. And
yes.
Another test of your developing medical values, I suppose.
Yes. Let me just lead to that by saying that I had the experience, which I should admit to, of in India before leaving, of trying to do something for a person who had an enormous goiter, a woman with an enormous goiter, and she was having trouble breathing. We thought that she would not live long with this. So we actually operated on it, and she died. And that was a very humbling experience. We were trying to do good, and we did a lot of harm. And that made me very cautious about using the power that medicine, unfortunately or fortunately, gives to physicians when they are in situations where people have nothing else. And I formed the resolution that I wanted to go as far as I could in learning the art of medicine and leading to a life in research. And with that view, when I came out of the army, I obtained a position as junior to Sheila Sherlock, who was the queen of the liver, both in Britain and indeed worldwide for many years. And she told me when I took the position that I was responsible for everything that happened on the ward, on 2 wards, while I was there. Even when if I wanted to take a day off, I was responsible for what happened when I was away. So in fact, there was very little time off, virtually none.
How much were you paid then?
One was given a keep. I mean, one was fed and housed. The money was nothing. I'm not sure it was absolutely zero, but it was trivial. One didn't look to it as an income. And
as you look back, were there some formative value experiences?
There were, and it's a little difficult to describe it exactly because it was an experimental unit. There were 50 beds, all people with liver disease, and gathered from all over the UK. And so in addition to treating them for their problems, there was also a very high level of research activity. And one of my jobs, I was told, was to protect the patients from the researchers. How well I did that is one of my problems. Some years later, a paper was published in the New England Journal in 1976 by a man called Beecher from Harvard. And he had 20 examples, subsequently reduced somewhat to 17, I think, of unethical research activity carried out in hospitals. And to my horror, I found not that my name was on the paper, but that I was resident at the Hammersmith Postgraduate School when a certain paper was named by Beecher as being unethical. At the time, and that's the worrisome part, we really didn't think it was unethical. I mean, it horrifies me to think how unethical it was without us realizing it. What was happening was that it was to show the deleterious effect of protein in people whose liver is not working well. And patients without consent were given protein, and that would make them more confused and in some cases go into coma. And then the protein would be stopped and they would come out of hepatic coma. It was then found that if you sterilized the bowel with an antibiotic and fed the protein, then they didn't go into coma. And this is because the actual ammonia intoxication was due to bacterial fermentation in the gut rather than the absorption of food by normal digestion. That may not sound very easy but to explain, but the principle is still used, I believe, in the management of hepatic coma. But at that time, the informed consent element was totally lacking.
So there we are in England with Sheila Sherlock, deep in the liver, and then somehow or other you find yourself in Canada very much into kidneys. How does that happen?
Yes, that's it sounds a bit strange, but I came to Canada because the chief of medicine at Barts Hospital, the medical school that I was also connected with, came to McGill as the chief of medicine. And although he didn't bring me in any sense, and he was very emphatic that I should not give that impression, he did tell me about a position, a teaching fellowship at McGill, and asked me if I wanted it, and gave me 24 hours to make up my mind. And I asked a few friends who came from Canada, they all said it was a good place to be, so I took it for a year. It's now 40 years later, but I came for a year in 1955.
I think you said somewhere in the notes I read that every opportunity needs an opportunist.
Well, yes.
And
let me just answer your other question, which was why the kidney? Well, when I'd finished being teaching fellow and then chief resident at the Royal Victoria Hospital, Christie said, now what are you going to do now to justify your continued presence around here? And I said, well, you know, what about the liver? And he said, oh, well, we're not ready for the liver in a formal, specialized sense. What about the kidney? And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, we need somebody in this new area of the kidney, and what we plan to do, if you are willing, is to send you to Chicago, to Cork and Pirani, where you have to learn kidney biopsy, because that's what we need. We need someone who can do kidney biopsies around here. So I was sent off to Chicago for a week and traveled by bus in order to save some money on the very inadequate grant that they gave me, and came back knowing how to do kidney biopsies. And from there on, I was one of two people who would answer consultations around the hospital at the Royal Vic on electrolyte and acid base and kidney problems. And the liver sort of faded into the background and has remained there ever since.
And you embraced your emphasis in kidney nephrology as, in retrospect, a lifelong ambition from that point on.
Yes, from there on, but there was something that cemented it, which I should tell you about. It was in the late spring of 1958 that an extraordinary event occurred, which happened to control my life thereafter. A young woman of 15 years was admitted to the Montreal Neurological Institute with convulsions and hypertension, and was stuporous. I was asked to see her. I was on call that weekend, and she had a high potassium and she was acidotic and she was in renal failure. The resident, who was very sharp in getting the history of this young woman, this girl, from her mother, came along quite excitedly and saying, you know, that person over there has an identical twin. And you can probably guess the rest. We decided that 5 cases of identical twin kidney transplant, we quickly established that the young girl had shrunken kidneys and chronic kidney disease, and 5 transplants between identical twins, this was long before any other type was tried, had been done in Boston, and we said, you know, would you like to go down there? And the mother said, no, we will take our chance with the whatever's going here. So we decided to do a kidney transplant. And this was in 1958. It was the first kidney transplant carried out in the Commonwealth. And you might be interested to realize that in 58, dialysis was a dangerous undertaking. So dangerous was it that we elected not to dialyze this young woman. She was in bad shape, but she wasn't convulsing all the time or anything, because we were afraid to dialyze her. So she was actually submitted to major surgery under conditions of advanced uremia. And it was one of the things I'll never forget, the speed with which urine came out of the ureter when the transplant was not quite, when the vascular anastomosis had been finished, but the rest of it hadn't been tidied up. And already there was a flow of clear golden fluid. And that was an exhilarating moment for us all, actually, everybody there.
Perhaps the high urea stimulated anosmotic diuresis.
Exactly. She had 11 liters of urine in the first day.
Right.
And of course, that was where a lot of skill actually came into, because we were doing 3-hourly total electrolyte balance with estimates for free body water and insensible loss and the whole thing. And it involved a team of people wielding slide rules, working out what the fluid intake should be.
Well, there you were then with this marvelous success, committed for life to kidneys. And
yes.
Was there any other formative medical, ethical event at the Vic in the 50s at McGill?
Well, we've discussed this, and yes, there was. While all these things were going on in the kidney side, I was also one of the physicians, and when I was chief resident, I was responsible for doing consultations at night in the Allen Memorial Institute, the psychiatric wing. And the now infamous, though then famous, Ewan Cameron was carrying out research on psychiatric patients. Again, I have to say, as with my experience in Hammersmith Hospital, the lack of ethics in this research of Cameron was not appreciated by anybody, myself very much included. The fact that he was giving people excessive doses of electroconvulsive therapy to try and deprogram the brain, hoping thereafter, having got rid of the psychosis, to be able to reprogram the brain. An extraordinary piece of medical hubris. This was being carried on without any consent, without any review. They had no research protocol review. It was based on trust. Patients trusted him to be doing things in their interests.
But let me ask you, though. You say that you really weren't aware that this wasn't optimal, but yet you are obviously a kindly, caring person, indeed the son of an Anglican minister. Surely part of you sensed that there was something that perhaps wasn't the way it should be.
I suppose, but I'm not, no, I don't, I have to stand condemned by a failure to be sensitive to what was going on. The part that concerned me most was the insulin coma. He had, one of the programs that was going on was keeping patients with psychiatric illness at a very low blood sugar for a week at a time. And I couldn't believe that that was good for the brain. That depatterning the brain by hyperglycemia seemed to me to be outrageous. And I did say that. But, you know, everybody said, look, I mean, this man Cameron, he's writing the new book on psychiatry. We're going to look back and say how proud we are that we were at the Royal Vic when Cameron was there.
But you did some experiments of your own, didn't you? In
yes.
Trying a new way of doing dialysis.
Yes, we did, and that is an interesting story which I must come clean on. This was way back in about 1961, before dialysis was firmly established. I should have mentioned that between 58 and 61, dialysis really came home. It was found that if you did it frequently, and particularly if you started earlier, previously it was always being left too late to start dialysis, that it was very effective treatment. But it was very expensive, and it was envisaged that there would never be enough money for everybody with renal failure to have dialysis. It turns out that that probably, for Western culture, Western countries, that is probably not the case. There probably is enough money for everybody to get dialysis, as we know. But in those days, it was not conceived that it would be possible to raise the $35,000 a year to keep a person alive on dialysis, so one had to look for other things. The one we looked at was called intestinal perfusion. Why not use the membranes that line our body cavities, or our gut, as particularly the small intestine, as a means of trying to get the poisons out? And we did this by constructing, with permission I must say, but I want to qualify that, by making a hole into the small bowel at the upper end, just beyond the duodenum, and a hole just before it enters the colon at the ileocecal region. And these two holes connecting to the bowel were then the sites for a perfusion system for 6 hours a day. During the rest of the time, the bowel was used for digestion. And this intestinal perfusion could control the urea completely, control the electrolyte balance, acid base, all that was very easily controlled by intestinal perfusion. But the patients died. And they died, unfortunately, from uric acid accumulation in the heart. Uric acid crystals were seen there at autopsy. The uric acid would not come out. And they also had very high creatinines. Moral of the story, why wasn't it done in dogs first? That's now, it's easy to say, well, here are patients that are dying, and we know we can't afford dialysis for them all. Why not try this and see if it works? And of course, there's enthusiasm to go ahead and do it. And of course, as you know, patients, when they're desperate, can be led to agree to things that perhaps one shouldn't have. And so the problem there was that it was research that had not gone through rigorous animal testing. We would say that the exigencies of the situation were so acute for these patients that there wasn't time to do the animal testing, but that's not a valid argument. I consider that whole episode unethical, in retrospect.
Now, John, the juxtaposition of dialysis versus transplantation reversed itself,
Yes.
as you said.
Yes.
You have noted that early on dialysis was dangerous,
Yes.
and transplantation was very experimental.
Yes.
And then a few years later, the reverse perhaps was true, that dialysis was well established and
Yes.
safe. In view of that, what made you continue to this big, full steam ahead thrust to make Canadian renal transplantation so vibrant?
Yes. And you're right in saying that there was a controversy going on in medical circles as to whether transplantation was justifiable if there was dialysis. And the reason for saying that transplantation should be persisted with, despite the fact that dialysis was getting better and better, was twofold. Firstly, in Montreal at the time, the Montreal General and the Hôtel-Dieu and Notre Dame Hospital were all doing long-term dialysis, and no other hospital was doing transplant. But that by itself would not be a good enough reason. The other reason was that there was very little going on in Eastern Canada at that time in treating renal failure. I mean, I'm one of the nephrologists, unfortunately, who can remember when most of the patients died in 2 to 3 months. And we would be sent patients from right way down to St. John's, Newfoundland, who were in extremis and who could not, there was no dialysis down there, so they either had to transport their entire family and come and live in Montreal, or accept something else. The extraordinary success of the identical twin transplant made one realize that there was a vision there. And then what happened in 1963 was when Roy Kahn, working with Murray at the Peter Ben Brigham Hospital in Boston, and Roy Kahn is a famous British transplant surgeon now, but at that time he was working on dogs in Boston and showed that Imiran, combined with actinomycin and radiation, could cause kidney transplants to persist in dogs. I think that was in 1963, and then the first clinical attempt with the same medications was 63, 64. And we at the Royal Vic decided we would put emphasis on that mode of treatment.
Which really is another...
Right.
Hold on.
Hold it.
Okay, anytime, David?
In my mind, David, the era of kidney transplantation, other than with identical twins, started when Roy Kahn and Jim Murray in Boston at the Peter Ben Brigham, he established the fact that the new agent, Imiran, combined with actinomycin C and radiation, would allow kidneys to survive across family differences in dogs. And that regimen was then immediately applied to humans, and unrelated people's kidneys were being moved from one to the other using that protocol, and it seemed to work. Now, how well did it work? The answer is not very well. So much so that there was a meeting in Washington, and we'd done 4 or 5 at the Royal Vic at this point. In, I think, 1965, the SIBA company drew everybody together for a symposium, and there was serious question as to whether kidney transplants were still being prematurely used on a human. And there was some talk about a moratorium. That all changed.
Yes, very interesting. Because not only did you go from liver to kidney and pass the early rocky stages of dialysis, but you were sufficiently committed to renal transplantation to even get into basic immunology.
Well, of course, what happened was that we started doing kidney transplants between unrelated people, and we got into rejection and a whole lot of different problems.
But let me
and
ask,
the immunologists
Yes.
were consulted,
Yes.
and they said, look, this is not our type of immunology. We can't really help you with this. You're going to have to work this out more or less for yourselves. And it's a fact that the allergists, who were basically the immunologists of the day, were not that interested in getting involved in kidney transplant immunology.
well then why didn't you just rely on the exciting and successful immunology work which was taking place elsewhere? Why did you feel you had to do it?
Well, because even the places elsewhere weren't doing transplant immunology at that time. So, you know, there was nobody to call, virtually speaking. You had to figure out a way, along, admittedly, with others who were facing similar problems, and try and find your way through this. So we rapidly developed what expertise we could in studying the antibodies that develop after transplantation and after dialysis or after blood transfusion, and tried to put together. And one of the most exciting events, of course, was finding out the deleterious effect of antibodies directed against kidney tissue groups, the HLA antibody, and the question of acute rejection. For example, the transplant that was carried out at the Montreal General Hospital, they had a transplant program which dropped in its tracks, because the first transplant that was carried out, I understand, was between a husband who received, a wife who received a kidney from her husband. And because of previous pregnancies, she had developed antibodies against those factors in her husband's tissue profile, which were foreign to her, because of the fact that these factors were carried on the fetus. So she was sensitized to her husband through pregnancy, and when they did the transplant, it went black on the table and had to be taken out within an hour. Now that, you see, that's transplant immunology. No allergist will tell you you couldn't do that.
Well, nothing seems to have intimidated you.
Well,
you did what you thought you had to do.
I think it was a feeling in those days, now we're going back a long way, that we'd gotten away from the fact that when you developed chronic kidney failure, you always died. And there were these various experimental forms. Admittedly, hemodialysis was establishing a better track record, though still considered enormously expensive. And it was just a persistence to carry on with this. And the fact that we were getting patients from elsewhere who couldn't be accommodated long term.
Could you tell me briefly this remarkable story or chapter in our long mystery story tell me about the circumstances that led you to do this human cross-circulation experiment?
Yes. In the early part of dialysis with a view to transplantation, which was the program that the Royal Victoria adopted, in those days one was using a lot of blood in dialysis. 4 units of blood a week were being used. And we found, when we started doing transplants to people who'd had over 100 units of blood in the preparatory period, that they actually did better than the transplants who were carried out on people who hadn't been on dialysis very long and hadn't been transfused very much. So much that in a paper that we presented to the Transplant Society in 1966, we claimed that our policy was, and indeed it was, that you didn't get a transplant until you had 100 units of blood, because it did better. Now that is, you might say, surely they would be fully sensitized. And this question has never been fully answered as to why, if you give blood directly into the vascular system, it doesn't sensitize. Indeed, it produces antibodies that may be beneficial. That was the basis for thinking that blood transfusion was beneficial. And indeed, many people, many units around the world prior to cyclosporin used to use blood transfusion as a preparatory aspect to transplantation. Well, we had a patient, a doctor called me from St. John's, Newfoundland. He said, I have this lady who lives at Burgeau on the south coast of Newfoundland. At that time, it was accessible at certain times of the year only by sea. And she had kidney failure, and I said, you know, we can't do anything for that, really. I mean, that lady it's the lack of access to medical facilities that is limiting her opportunity. He was a deontologist, I'm happy to say, and so he just put her on a plane with a little note attached to her saying, please see and advise. And she finished up on the ward in Montreal. And we didn't know what to do with this lady. She had a number of kids, and she was mother of a family of 5, I think, and there she was. We had more or less decided that all we could do was to give her peritoneal dialysis until she was feeling well, and then discharge her. There was no question of the family translocating to a dialysis unit, to a part of the country where there was dialysis. And then another resident, and I must say both stories I've told about the sharpness of the resident is a striking aspect of it. A resident said to me, you know, that lady there who has hepatic disease and is dying, and this patient here have the same blood group. And he said to me, you've been prattling on about blood being good for transplants and things.
Prattling on.
Yeah, well, I don't know whether she used those terms. But this resident said, you know, if one was to use this patient, I mean, if these two patients were to come into some sort of association, would there be any possibility? And the protocol rapidly formed that given proper consent, and by now we were getting proper consent, could these two people live in some sort of symbiosis? The liver of the uremic patient taking care of the liver problem for the other lady, and the kidneys of the liver patient taking care of the uremia of the first patient. And we decided, with Lloyd McLean, Chief of Surgery, very much supporting this, that we, and both families agreed to a trial of intermittent cross-circulation. Both the patients were stuporous. It was carried out in an intensive care unit. The arms were connected by celastic tubing. The volume of the two patients was adjusted by, they were both on bed scales, and the volume was controlled by just a simple screw clamp. You could make one go up in weight and the other go down in weight and keep them in kilter. And the kidney of the liver patient was excreting quite fast, and the skin of the uremic patient became a bit yellow. And they both sort of woke up and said, where am I? It was a remarkable experience. And they were alert.
What year was this now?
This would be about 66, 7.
Now,
And then we carried this on for, well, then we were with a dilemma. This was working. We disconnected them, and they lived their separate lives for about 3 or 4 days, and then it didn't look so good, so we hooked them up again, and again both improved. And the question was, how long could this go on? And we tentatively said, well, we'll do it for 6 months and see how everything looks at the end of that time. Built into this agreement, I should say, was that if one died, then the organ that the other needed would be provided by the cross-circulation partner. And what happened was that it happened on Labor Day weekend, 66, I guess, when the surgeon was in Algonquin Park having a good holiday, that the liver lady died from variceal bleeding into the bowel. And so there was a considerable delay in putting her kidney into the uremic patient from Newfoundland. But this did take place, and there was a 19-day period of oliguria, during which time I must say people were looking at me as if I was a bit of a monster. And then the kidney started to work, and she went home. She lived for 9 years, and she had a baby called Victoria after the hospital.
well, here you are working on Labor Day, working many nights. We won't even speculate what the cost was to your family.
No.
But still, you weren't satisfied. You got involved with helping the formation of the Canadian Society of Nephrology, and perhaps even more so, the Kidney Foundation of Canada. Why would you have done that?
Well, I think the Kidney Foundation one I can answer more directly, because it was clear that what one needed was research. I mean, we were involved in things that we barely understood, that had vision of a future, and yet was also fraught with all sorts of dangers and mistakes. I was looking after a young architect, Montreal architect called Morty Tarda, and he had good pastures syndrome, and he was not doing well. We tried to dialyze him, but he was bleeding into the lungs, and generally speaking, he had a very stormy course, and he died. He was about 35 or so. And his father said, this is unspeakably tragic. Isn't there anything that someone can do about this? I mean, why do we have to have this sort of thing? And not then, but a little later, I got in touch with him and said, you know, what we need is research. And is there any possible way in which you can think how one might raise money to do research? And he was enthusiastic. I mean, he saw this as bringing closure in some way to his grief. And he had a shop on Saint-Henri, district in Montreal, and he was part of a group of people there. And he got them all together, and one in particular took a lead and said he would get involved. And they formed a group which was going to form a kidney foundation. Now there were problems getting the Kidney Foundation started. We didn't know how to do it. I was working with Guy Lemieux from the Hôtel-Dieu, and we sounded out opinion across the country, urologists and nephrologists, and they were all keen, at least most of them were. Some of them thought it was unnecessary, believe it or not. And then this lay group got in touch with the National Kidney Foundation of the States, and there was some dialogue there. So the conclusion was that we should form a society to raise money. In the first 3 years, they raised $3,000 a year. Last year, 1968, they raised $3 million. And I understand that the figure has been comparable to that for the last few years. It's an extraordinary cause of quite satisfaction to see how this thing eventually grew. We had opposition. We had opposition from the heart group. They said, why can't you just be a part of the heart?
And why can't you just be part of the heart group? Why does every disease have to have its own patient advocacy group?
I think the answer is that the problems are unique and expensive, and the direction of research is not the same. And there was absolute agreement amongst those who were supporting the Kidney Foundation in the early stages. And one of the strongest supporters was Yves Fortier, the subsequently Canada's ambassador to the United Nations. And it was actually he that staved off that question as to why it should be, why shouldn't it be part of something else.
Could you say a brief word about the Canadian Society of Nephrology?
Yes, that actually formed 3 or 4 years after the Kidney Foundation. Originally, the urologists, who were well organized, offered to have a medical branch of the Canadian Urological called the Canadian Nephrological. And they invited us to join with them. They gave us honorary membership. And 6 of us went to their meeting at St. Andrews, New Brunswick, in '64, I think. But the 6 who were there had various interests, as you know. I mean, people who go into nephrology at that time came from all over the shop. Some were interested in calcium and bone metabolism, and then electrolytes, and then kidney. And some were coming from other directions, endocrinology, hypertension into the kidney. And they didn't really have that much in common with straight urology. So the decision was then made to form a Canadian society. The first meeting was at the Chateau Laurier here in Ottawa, I think in '65, and the ultimate charter, I think, dates from '67. At that time, by that time, there was about 60 or 70 people who called themselves nephrologists in Canada.
Well, so we have now the picture of a minister's son, experience in India, liver experience in England, Montreal, pioneering kidney transplantation, undaunted by being a self-taught immunologist, stimulating patient advocacy, and then why would you want to move all across this big country to the Rockies?
Yes. Well, again, I had to make a choice. Up to now, it was opportunism. I grabbed at opportunities. I was made a career investigator of the Medical Research Council in '66, I think it was, and in '67 or '8, I was visited by the MRC, the Medical Research Council sent a team. And Frank Dixon, who, as you know, was a famous nephropathologist at La Jolla in California, was part of that team, and he nailed me. He said, here you are, you're fooling around with immunology and transplants, and you're trying to be the big clinical doctor in nephrology. You can't go on doing these two things. You have to choose. You either stay with the MRC and do research, or let that slide a bit and continue to run a clinical service.
Now, he said this to you during a visit.
He intimated it, and in a little conversation we had, and then I had emphasis on this from the MRC as feedback.
Yes, from his written report.
Yes.
Yes.
And I decided I would take the research route.
And give up seeing patients.
Well, not give them up altogether, but no longer be sort of prominent in that area. And so I made certain demands of McGill, which they couldn't meet or refused to meet. I said, you know, I need a proper lab, I need $250,000 worth of equipment, stuff like that. And at that time, Lionel MacLeod went from Edmonton to Calgary, and Lionel had been fairly big in the Canadian Society of Nephrology, and more particularly there was a man called Walter Mackenzie, who was Dean of Medicine out there, and he wanted kidney transplants in Edmonton, University of Alberta. And he had a lot of influence, did Walter Mackenzie. He'd been president of the Royal College, he'd been president of the American Society of Surgery, I think, and American College of Surgery. And he got the government of Alberta to say that they would underwrite $300,000 for a lab in transplant immunology at the University of Alberta if Walter could find the person. That's really how the screws went.
Right.
So happened that Malcolm Brown, the president of the Medical Research Council, also intimated to me that if I made this move and started something in transplant immunology out in Alberta, that this would be a very suitable place for them to cite an MRC group, a research group, financed entirely by a Medical Research Council. And so he sort of said, you know, if you make that move, then you get on with putting in an application. And I should also mention that the university in Alberta also recruited Erwin Diener from Melbourne, Australia, who was a basic immunologist at last. And so the idea was that there would be two directors of this unit, one more clinical but looking toward basic, and one basic and hopefully looking a bit to clinical. And the MRC then funded that, and we had it for 10 years. It was very well funded, and we were very fortunate.
But let me repeat, if I may, the question. Leaving your patients, leaving this close contact in large measure, didn't that foster in you some discomfort?
Yes.
Was there any sense of abandonment in the heart of this Anglican minister's son?
Yes, there was. And I think it was reflected by the fact that I didn't actually take up new patients in Alberta for a couple of years. I did entirely the research thing. And that difficulty in academic medicine between dedication to patients and the problems of dedication to research, and you can't do them both fully, is a dilemma for academic medicine.
Indeed.
You may have experienced it too. And nearly everybody who does research in academic medicine as a physician finds this problem. And
Yes.
then move from there into why did I move to ethics?
All right. Okay.
David, we're rolling tape anytime you're ready.
What are some of the highlights of your early years in Alberta with the MRC group?
The focus was quite different now. I was not responsible for patients with clinical problems. We started to look into the whole question of tissue typing. Histocompatibility is the fancy word, but it's really tissue groups as distinct from blood groups. And we were looking for special populations because there one might expect the different tissue groups to be simpler. And we decided on the Arctic and went up in quite a large expedition to, again, well-financed by MRC, I have to say, to study histocompatibility amongst the Inuit. The Inuit are, in a sense, an inbred strain of human. They have been inbreeding or interbreeding in a relatively limited number of people for 20,000 years. And we found, in fact, that there were a whole lot of families where they all typed the same. And we were able to find what at that time was important in histocompatibility, namely homozygous cells, people with homozygous HLA antigens on their cells. And we actually sent these frozen in liquid nitrogen ampoules around the world to the histocompatibility labs and workshops. And that was that was very expensive, of course, but it was worthwhile. And we did do skin grafting there. And we were very much helped by somebody who could speak the language, Dr. Schaefer. Then I did similar work with the Hutterites in Alberta who, although nothing like inbreeding or close breeding is perhaps the better term, for so long, only a couple of hundred years since they went from Germany out to this continent, they also have a very limited number of tissue antigens and were able to give certain insights into histocompatibility. Those were two of the areas, but the main area, I suppose, was immunological monitoring of the events going on in the blood of patients after transplant, both cells, that were trained to be killer cells to the transplant, as well as antibodies.
Now, nobody was immune from your inquisitiveness. In fact, you yourself fell prey to your own curiosity.
Yes, I have to admit to that. We were looking for enhancing antibodies that would help grafts survive. And we thought we'd found one. And it happened to react with my cells. And at any rate, it led to a protocol that we thought was worth doing, and we didn't want to go through all the rigmarole of an ethics board. So we decided on human experimentation between the two investigators. Well, the other investigator went pretty well. I gave him some of my skin and some of the serum, etc. Unfortunately, the lab had misread part of the test in my case, so that when the serum was run into my veins, I developed an anaphylactic reaction. And I've said this a number of times, if you ever want to see the head of your department and the dean of your faculty in short order, this is one way of doing it, because I remember waking up in the emergency and there were these two faces looking at me somewhat anxiously. But it all went off, nothing much, there was no residuum, but it did teach me something about the ethics of auto-experimentation. It is a serious matter, not to be undertaken lightly, and does require ethics review. And that's the part that I think is very important.
But you knew that before you started the experiment.
Yeah, I guess.
Well then, here we are, or here you are, at about the age of 60, when most people want to have a summer boat and slow down and play golf and read. And then you made another big move.
Yeah. By this time, and we're talking about a period of 20 years in Alberta now, I had moved more or less back into clinical work. And some of the research had metamorphosed into other things, and I was no longer primarily involved in them, though I was still supported by a Medical Research Council. And one day there was an article in the Edmonton Journal and subsequently in the Globe and Mail where one of the patients had said, for $5,000 I will give anybody $5,000 if they will give me a kidney. And he had been on dialysis. He was a very intelligent businessman, actually. He got fed up. And he said, I want out of this. And he developed this stratagem for doing so. He had 200 people from across the country offer to be tissue type give him a kidney for $5,000. Seems absurd. And then we pointed out to him that this was against the law. So he said, fine, I'll ask for a kidney for love. And he did so. And he had about 6 people who were very keen to give him a kidney out of love, whom he'd never seen. And he came along and said, now what are you going to do about it? And I said, you know, this isn't our policy. And he said, who made you the policy maker? By what right do you, as a physician involved in this game, make social policy for Canadians? And of course, he's quite right. We do make these presumptions. And it caused me to think very much as to, you know, just who does empower physicians and the medical world to make enormous decisions on strategy and policy. And the answer is nobody. There is obviously trust that the medical world will do the right thing in the long run. But it made me very interested in the interaction between public policy and medical practice. At the same time, I was also concerned about the fact that I thought people were making difficult and wrong decisions, particularly older people, in going on dialysis and not being able to do anything about it when it didn't go right. And we formed a quality of life committee that didn't actually interview patients, but did discuss their problems at length. And on this committee were non-medical people, and we tried to see how societal values could impact medical decision-making in such a difficult decision where one's life was at stake, and yet if you make a mistake, your life becomes miserable. All these things combined with the fact that I felt my fire for research had burnt out pretty much, made me determined to take a sabbatical, and that's where I must say the academic life is wonderful in being able to give you an opportunity to go off and do something.
How old were you at that time?
I would be 61.
61.
Yeah.
So you went off to the Hastings Institute.
Yes, I went to David Roy at the Institute for Clinical Research in Montreal for a short time, and I went to Al Johnson at the San Francisco. He's been there for many years teaching medical ethics, and then, but by far the best experience was the Hastings Center in New York and the Kennedy Institute course in Georgetown.
Now,
and during all that time, I put together a proposal for a bioethics initiative at the University of Alberta, which Doug Wilson, whom you know, a nephrologist who was dean, bought. And he said that they wanted this, and so I was sort of mandated to develop it, and so on.
And what is it called today?
Well, today it's called the John Dossetor Health Ethics Center. They gave me that honor of renaming it when I left last year.
Now, John, despite your kindliness and compassion, you're rather feisty. You have some strong views on purchasing or vending kidneys, and you haven't hesitated to express them. Do you think people should be permitted to buy and sell kidneys?
To be quite frank, I think that people should be able to do what they want with their own bodies. I happen to not want to do that, but if someone felt that they should, I see no reason why, just as I don't see that someone who wants to prostitute themselves for money should be put in jail or somehow inhibited. The question is, who has the right to get involved in that transaction? And I don't think the medical world should ever get involved in a monetary transaction involving tissue or organs. I'm not saying that I don't think that if someone is convinced they should have the right to sell the body, part of their body, that is their right. They own their own body. But I do think that for society to get involved in this, and particularly medical society, they are betraying the trust that the public has every expectation and right to have in the integrity of the medical people.
Well, we're coming to the end of at least this spiritual and value inquiry into your development and helping others. What effect do you think you have had and your center has had on young physicians in Alberta and on others?
And that's a difficult question.
That's why I asked it.
I think the answer to the question is we'll have to wait and see. I think my initiative in bioethics is part of a wider initiatives that are going on elsewhere in bioethics. Bioethics or ethics in healthcare delivery is a growing subject. It's a rapidly growing area. The old authority, the apprenticeship, physicians learning their ethical behavior from their paternalistic mentors, all that's going or is gone, hopefully. And a new way of looking at decision-making in patients participating. In fact, even the word patient is a bit of a problem, I think. It's still widely used, and I still use it, but it's people who have illnesses should participate with their physicians in a joint development of a comprehensive treatment, which they comprehend. It's more than consent. I'm personally a believer in comprehended consent rather than informed consent. And I think all that is part of a movement that is hopefully improving, one might even say cleansing, some of the paternalism and so on out of medical practice.
Now, there's a practical contribution which you have made. You've been called upon to look at organ donation and organ retrieval in Canada. It's not a coincidence that you're a nephrologist and an ethicist. Could you comment on that? There are useful things that come out of your work.
Well, I think that, in a sense, there is recognition that I have made certain commitments in my life, and why not use it? I mean, I think it's natural that people should want to at least have that viewpoint represented. And I have been flattered, actually, by the fact that people still are interested in having me participate in those things, even though my contact with the bedside problem is rapidly receding, or has receded. My knowledge of medicine, I found, has decreased considerably. It's now nearly 10 years since I practiced medicine. I don't have a license anymore. So I really am only qualified to speak on values and that component of the process. And I'm happy to do that.
Well, it's decreased from a stunningly high level.
Well, I don't know about that.
Members of the International Society of Nephrology might say that your career would only have been possible as a nephrologist. That is to say, your achievement in medical ethics, your inquiry into medical values, into patient advocacy, really is inimicably related to the fact that you had early experience watching so many patients die. You are aware of rationalization of scarce resources, and we spoke of this question of organ vending. Mm-hmm. Do you think a non-nephrologist, or had you been a dermatologist or a neurosurgeon, you would have had the same trajectory in this story of your professional life?
I can only speculate, and I think I agree with you that the group, I believe I've been enormously privileged to live through a period of medical development. It happens to be most acute in the kidney field, where it started from 100% failure and finished up with 95% success, either in dialysis or transplant. All through that period, I think nephrologists have been very fortunate, and their experience, whether this will happen in the future, you know, one hates to think that that the future cannot be as rosy as the past seems for those who have had the sort of opportunities that I've had. I think it probably is, but one can't foresee that at the moment. But I do believe that nephrology and kidney failure has given a group of people considerable opportunity that would not have necessarily come from neurosurgery or dermatology.
Who will carry on now in the future, John?
I don't know. That's as far as ethics is concerned in medicine, I think that's going to carry on. That's in a growth phase. It's going to be partly with physicians, and I hope increasingly so, though there are problems financial in going into ethics for physicians because it's not as well paid. I think women, nursing, that's another of the important things that I believe, that nurses and physicians have to fully share their experiences and their decision-making. And although there are laws concerned as who can write orders that are used, or have been used in the past, for physicians making their own minds up and excluding nurses from that decision, all that's going to go, or has gone. I think dialysis units are a very good example of how there is shared decision-making between nurses and physicians. So I think there are movements afoot that are going to go on developing and maturing. Who? Well, I don't know. Everybody, I guess.
John, perhaps as our last question, which of course we can edit out, if a young John Dossetor of 24 years old could sit beside us and listen, what might he comment on your remarkable life?
Oh. I think that the person should say to herself, well, this is just one episode. This is one phase of the development of medicine and of healthcare and of health, creation of health, which is a lot different from delivering healthcare. And the opportunities, these guys can't see the opportunities that are going to come my way. And I hope that they come my way so that I can, 50 years later, say, well, no one could foresee the opportunities that were going to come to me, this person sitting here, but I hope that they will be as worthwhile and as privileged.
Well, John, Dr. Dossetor, on behalf of the International Society of Nephrology, thank you ever so much for sharing this insight into the mystery and the joy of your most